This is Dimitri Lascaris for The Real News. As The Real News reported last week, a gigantic iceberg has broken off from the massive Larsen C ice shelf in Antarctica. The iceberg, covering 5,800 square kilometers, weighs about 1 trillion tons and is among the 10th largest such breakaway in recorded history. All of this has refocused attention on the question of climate change and sea level rise. Now here to discuss this with us is Robert Kopp, a climate scientist, geobiologist, and climate policy scholar. He serves at Rutgers University as director of the Institute of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, and as a professor in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. Robert joins us today from Brooklyn, New York. Thanks very much for joining us, Professor Kopp.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So first of all, Professor Kopp, what does the scientific evidence suggest? Does it suggest that this calving event in Antarctica is related to climate change? And to what degree can we expect, if at all, that this iceberg will affect sea level rise in the reasonably foreseeable future?
Yeah, so the Larsen C ice shelf calving event is part of what ice shelves do. Ice shelves calve naturally, but today they're doing it on a planet where every element of the climate has been affected by the greenhouse gases we've been putting into the atmosphere. So while we can't say that the Larsen C ice shelf wouldn't have calved without those greenhouse gases, it is indicative of a growing vulnerability and growing trend in what we're seeing in the Antarctic.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of how this might affect sea level rise going in the future, and I'm talking particularly about this 5,800 square kilometer iceberg, what does the scientific analysis tell us about that?
So when you think about sea level rise from somewhere like the Antarctic, you want to distinguish between ice sheets and ice shelves. So the Antarctic ice sheet is sitting up on the continent. And so if the Antarctic ice sheet shrinks, that's water that's moving from the continent into the ocean. When an ice shelf melts, it's already in the water. It's already displaced the ocean. So it doesn't have a direct effect on sea level to speak of. However, ice shelves do play an important role because they're sitting in the ocean, sort of slowing the flow of ice from the continent into the ocean. And so when you have fewer ice shelves, you remove what's called a buttressing effect. So it allows the ice sheet to flow more quickly into the ocean. And ice sheets flowing into the ocean do contribute to sea level rise.
Mm-hmm. And these ice shelves are also reflecting sunlight. And their evaporation or their melting presumably would have some impact on that issue as well. Is that something that is measurable? Is that something that we ought to be concerned about?
So I think you're referring to what we call the ice albedo effect. So ice is bright, it's reflective, and ocean is dark. And so when you melt ice and replace it with ocean, as we've seen a lot in the Arctic, you change how reflective the planet is overall, and that leads to an increase, an amplification of warming. And that's one of the reasons why the Arctic, where you have ocean that's usually covered by sea ice, its melt is leading to faster warming in the Arctic than we see on the global average.
Mm-hmm. So this year, I understand scientists increased their estimates, or at least some who had researched this issue, of maximum plausible sea level rise for the third time in the past few years. The research, including from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, estimated that the plausible maximum sea level rise could be as great as 2.7 meters by 2100. You recently, I understand, co-authored a study which concluded that we should anticipate a far greater level of sea level rise looking beyond that window of time, assuming that we continue with current trends in greenhouse gas emissions. And the estimate that I saw, and particularly was one that was talked about by NASA scientist Eric Rignaud, was 6 to 9 meters of sea level rise, something that was obviously well beyond the estimates that we're seeing with respect to the time frame up to 2100. What is the likelihood that we're going to see that level of sea level rise looking beyond 2100? And in what time frame in your opinion, can we anticipate seeing that level of sea level rise if we continue with a business as usual scenario in terms of greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, so that 6 to 9 meter number comes from the study of the previous warm period before now, a period we call the last interglacial. when scientists' best estimate is that global average temperatures were about 1 to 2 degrees Celsius warmer than they were in the pre-industrial. So at the low end, roughly comparable to what they are today. At the high end, about a degree Celsius warmer. And what we found is that during the last interglacial stage, global average sea level was, as you said, about 6 to 9 meters higher than today. Now, the shape of Earth's orbit during the last interglacial was different from today, so you can't just go and say, well, because it was about 1 degree warmer than pre-industrial then, and it's 1 degree warmer than pre-industrial now, we're definitely committed to 6 to 9 meters of sea level rise. But it is somewhat indicative. And so I would take it as an indication that in the 1 to 2 degrees Celsius warming level, could be a commitment to 6 to 9 meters of sea level rise. But a commitment to sea level rise is different than realizing that sea level rise on a timescale that matters to humans. With 1 to 2 degrees Celsius of warming, I would expect that 6 to 9 meters of sea level rise to play out over several millennia. If you're looking at sort of a fossil fuel intensive business as usual scenario, though, the commitment to sea level rise may be much larger. Last time carbon dioxide concentrations were as high as they might be if we don't slow our fossil fuel emissions. The ice sheets on the planet were much smaller.
So, Professor Kopp, I understand you've also researched the issue of the rate at which sea levels are rising relative to the pre-industrial era. What does the current scientific literature tell us about the rate of sea level rise relative to pre-industrial levels of sea level rise?
Yeah, so our research group and our collaborators had a paper out about a year ago looking at reconstructing sea level change over the last 3,000 years. So this allows us to see that there is variability in sea level over this time period on the order of about 10 to 20 centimeters, so about 4 to 8 inches, and that variability is tied to changes in temperature. So, for instance, sea level was a little bit lower during the Little Ice Age. But one of the key findings of our work is that the rate of sea level rise during the 20th century, which was about 6 inches over the course of the century, was faster than during any century that we could recover in our record, up to at least 800 BC. So we concluded from that study that the 20th century rate of sea level rise was the fastest in at least 28 centuries, and we're warming faster. Sea level is rising faster than that now. So the current rate of sea level rise is about 3 millimeters per year, which would be about a foot per century, about twice as fast as it was over the course of the 20th century.
And my understanding is that your research didn't conclude that the rate of sea level rise before 800 BC was necessarily higher than it is today. It's just that the record prior to 800 BC is not adequately robust for you to come to any conclusions about the rate of sea level rise then vis-a-vis today. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, and that's correct. You may well have to go back many millennia before that to encounter sustained sea level rise on the rates we're seeing.
Right. And lastly, you're a climate policy scholar. In light of what you know today about the threat of sea level rise, what would be your principal recommendations to policymakers for dealing with that threat?
Yeah. So there's two main types of approaches to dealing with this. So one, we're fairly clear that the more carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere, the more sea level is going to rise. So if we were to be on a business as usual, burn lots of fossil fuel trajectory for the next century, we could lock in many, many meters of sea level rise. We might be looking at 15 to 20 meters of sea level rise or more locked in, and potentially even 6 meters, 20 feet to be realized over the next couple of centuries. But if we were to reduce emissions to keep warming in the range of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, we could slow that down a lot. So my number one recommendation would be to try to avoid sea level rise by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That said, the oceans are going to rise even if we're on a low emissions trajectory. They're doing it now, and they're going to continue to do that into the future. And so we need to be preparing our cities and communities along the coast for more frequent flooding, for greater flooding associated with storms, and for the possibility that some communities may not be sustainable in the locations they are now. And so there's not a cookie cutter recommendation for that, except to say that as we think about the future of our coastal communities, we have to realize that they do have sea level rise in store for them, and make sure we are handling their futures and contemplating their futures in a manner that takes that into account.
And what major urban centers along the coasts of the United States would you say are essentially non-viable at this stage, looking out, in a 50 to 100 year time frame, as a result of the sea level rise that we can anticipate no matter what we do in terms of carbon emissions in the future?
I would be hesitant to go so far as to call a community non-viable, because people can have creative approaches to dealing with that. If you look at the Netherlands, most of the Netherlands is below sea level now. So there's a lot I think we can do to adapt. That said, some cities are going to have harder situations than others. So if you look at South Florida, where you have a bunch of communities that are sitting on porous limestone bedrock, they're going to have a harder time protecting themselves from the sea than somewhere like New York City, where you have a relatively concentrated population in sitting mostly on harder bedrock. So I would be hesitant to write off any of our cities at the moment. I do think some smaller barrier island communities may have to seriously contemplate their future. And in the long term, with unchecked sea level rise, certainly it may become increasingly hard for cities like Miami.
Well, this has been Dimitri Lascaris speaking to climate scientist Professor Robert Kopp. Professor Kopp, I very much hope we can have you on the program in the near future to talk to you at greater length about the economic implications of sea level rise, because I think that's a subject that's not discussed nearly enough today by the mainstream media. I want to thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And this is Dimitri Lascaris for The Real News.